All right. It looks like we are live, Michael. Welcome. I'll say welcome everyone to today's DX Cafe event on content and composability, content strategies for and in the enterprise. I'm Matthew McQueenie from Conabos. Just as we go along here, if you have any thoughts, comments, post them into the comments thread and we will make sure to answer those either as we see them coming or certainly at the end. As I noted, Michael's here. Michael Andrews is the content strategy evangelist at content.ai. And we're going to have a great discussion today, again, about content strategies in the enterprise. So, had the chance to meet with Michael in person a couple weeks ago at the
Yeah, that's
Content
right.
AI
Yeah.
Horizon. So, we got a nice picture in person there with Akshay and I. Michael, thank you for being with us. Could you introduce yourself, a bit of your backstory, and why your Twitter name is Story Needle?
Sure, Matt. Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. This is a delightful opportunity to talk about my favorite subject here, which is about content strategy and how it fits into the sort of the evolution of how we work with content. And my story is, if I just take a chunk of it, for the past 20 plus years, I've been working in the field of user experience and content strategy. And so maybe for the past decade or so, I've been particularly focused on content strategy because I really feel content is the thing that really determines whether or not an experience is a good one or a bad one for customers. So I've focused on that and spent most of my time working in a consulting role. But for the past almost 4 years now, I've been working with Content.ai as their content strategy evangelist. And so what I do is I help to talk about how enterprises can think about how they work with content and then sort of tie it into some of the possibilities that these newer ways of working can support them. So that's what I've been doing. I've been doing a lot of talking and writing and just evangelizing out there. And it's a great chance to talk to you. And concerning the story needle, that's the handle for my Twitter. It's also I started maybe a decade ago a blog called Story Needle, and really it kind of combines sort of two ideas. One is story, and content is really about story. It's not necessarily telling a full story. Content really is about helping people make a story out of what they're trying to do, right? To support them on their journey. So that's part of it. And the needle really is about the direction. I mean, there's lots of devices out there that, like a compass, for example, or a needle on a phonograph, or, the needle for a thread. All these things provide direction to something. So I guess that's what I was thinking of when I came up with that name.
A good content person is always telling stories. So we hear the term evangelism a lot
Mm.
in the space we work in. Content strategy evangelism was something that was kind of new to me when I met you and heard about your role. I hear tech evangelism, company evangelism, right?
Yeah.
But when we look at content strategy evangelism itself, what exactly is that? What are your responsibilities? What's your day-to-day like?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting role because I was the only person for a long time who even had this job title. And there actually have been a few people now since I've started working in this who have adopted a similar job title. So I think that's cool. If people are emulating things you're doing, that's always a sign that maybe there's value in what you're doing. Essentially, I'm trying to get enterprises interested in really developing their content strategies more fully. Now, to get value out of a product like ours, content.ai, you really need to have a content strategy and have that really developed. You can't expect that you just buy a piece of equipment and then suddenly everything is going to magically work perfectly for you. You also need to change how you work with your content, and it involves change management. It involves rethinking your approaches to doing things, developing better processes, putting standards in place, getting the right people on board rather than just expecting everyone to start using a new tool, but making sure they have the right training, making sure you have roles defined for what people need to do. All these sorts of things are part of content strategy. So a lot of what I do is really to help people understand the all these dimensions that they ought to be thinking about as they're thinking about modernizing their the tools that they use, and making sure that they have these other things in place so that they're successful in what they're trying to achieve overall. And in terms of what I do, I mean, it kind of varies by the week. I do a lot of public outreach, like this discussion we're having today. I talk at conferences. Last month, I was giving a couple of big presentations at a couple of different conferences. I do a lot of writing. I also do a lot of liaison within our own company to give some perspectives on what I think our clients would be most interested in, because I have a lot of subject matter expertise on how people work with content internally in large organizations. So I try to share that with our my colleagues in the company, as well as our partners too, when I have an opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Well, we're going to dive in specifically to our topic, content operations in the enterprise. And what we like to do here is bring some tweets, some writings, and things that we see from our esteemed guests. And I saw this one you had here, and I really thought it stuck out. It was a Twitter thread on the Story Needle, and just I want to say strategy is still a real thing that gets dismissed, and is as seriously important as ever. It has grown up, yet still needs to grow up. It's too big and complicated to be defined by a simple definition or be solved with stock best practices. Content strategy needs deeper specialization, but it also needs more cohesive synthesis of its complex parts. No matter how long you may have worked in content strategy, it constantly offers fresh issues to consider and resolve. I love the vitality of the subject. So we're going to talk into this, but I wanted that to kind of lead in, because even, you're kind of saying this is always evolving, we're always learning, and that's really the best way to go. So let's jump into content operations in the enterprise. So myself, I grew up as a blogger. I wrote for big news organizations and operations in the past, and the job included writing, posting, editing, distributing, doing your own SEO for your work, social sometimes, right? But that's not what an enterprise operations is looking at. So I'm going to start off by asking you, how is what I just described different than content operations in the enterprise?
Yeah, so I think what you've described is how a lot of organizations have approached it in the past, and indeed some organizations still approach it that way, at least in parts. And what's really changed is we in the past really thought about developing content as a individual activity. Someone decides what they want to write, they write it, they toss it in a content management system, maybe WordPress or something like that. They hit the publish button, they're done. And it's gotten to, that has a lot of limitations. I mean, it's fine for a very small activity. You can do that, but when you get into a large organization, you need to coordinate what everyone is doing. So you can't have a bunch of people doing their own thing without coordinating it. And then we find that very simple workflow we just talked about there isn't really sufficient. You're missing out on a lot of things that you need to consider. So what I think content operations has changed to, it's now a team sport. So rather than being this individual sport where you could be a rock star on your own and be writing great content, and that's all that mattered. Now we got to think about how the whole team is working and working together. And you just had mentioned before we got on the air about the World Cup, and so people kind of realize that team sports have a lot of different people involved with it, both you know on the pitch there as well as behind the scenes making things happen. And that our content operations are a lot like that. So we're thinking about this coordination and making sure that nothing gets forgotten, that we're trying to improve everything, and importantly moving away from this kind of stovepiped way that we've thought about content in the past, where everyone's just doing their own thing and no one's really worrying about what other people are doing.
So you actually have a really good guide you put together. I think it was last year on content operations maturity, I
Hmm.
believe.
Yeah.
And so let's say somebody, an organization, we don't have to use a name, is fully mature on your content model. I'm interested in what does the composition of that team look like? How many roles are there? How do the people, the resources fit into those roles? Are they cross-functional? What do you see out there with that?
Yeah. So let me qualify a bit of something you just said about the fully mature organization. No one is there yet. As you said in the start, I mean, this is constantly evolving. So it's maybe a little misleading to think that someone's going to reach that sort of a point where they're going to be so mature and they don't have anything else to worry about. What we find though is that parts of organizations get more mature. There's often a lot of unevenness in large organizations because they have been doing their own thing. So you have different pockets of the organization doing their own thing, and some pockets then sort of realize the importance of improving the maturity and they move up that ladder, and other parts are still a bit behind. So there's opportunities for the lagging parts to learn from other parts of the organization that are doing better, and then the ones that are doing better are still looking to improve what they're doing. But in terms of the composition, and this is really important, we want to be thinking about roles and responsibilities because that's a big part of how we coordinate things. And so, what job roles do we have associated with content? And in the past, there really haven't been very well defined job roles. Maybe you hired some writers of some sort. They may have a name like copywriter. Maybe or as a marketing writer, something like that. You might have a web manager, but there weren't a lot of very specific roles. And when there weren't well-defined roles, people were expected to do everything. And of course, people didn't have the capacity to do that either in terms of time or expertise. So things weren't done very well. So now we're finding that in more mature operations, you are starting to define roles more specifically. And people have, specialized roles. So I mean, most organizations have roles that are dedicated to, say, SEO, for example. I mean, that's a pretty common one. But we have these other roles that are not just about writers. And in fact, writers are becoming more and more just one of many roles in an organization. So you may have people who are what are called content designers, and they're thinking more about how the content fits in sort of the design of the user experience overall. Um, you have people who are content architects, and they're thinking about how to structure the content so that it can be more flexible and can be used in more different ways. There are, just a growing number of roles that are getting a bit more specialized, and that's because people realize that you have to give people responsibility to define um, how things are done in order to improve them.
Great. And you actually made me think of one thing. There's a thought leader go-to-market strategist in the front end as a service business,
Mhm.
and he had noted to me that a lot of programmers, developers are doing content entry, and that's quite an inefficient use of that resource, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's a little scary depending upon how they're doing it, because I mean you want to keep your content separated from the code. So if a front end developer is entering the content, sounds to me like that content is getting mingled in with the code, which is never a good thing to do.
Absolutely. Well, let's dig deeper into some of the key concepts that we hear a lot in this realm.
Hmm.
And I like to always ask simple questions because I think sometimes folks might nod along, right, when they hear certain things. So I'll ask the stupid question, right? Not, there are no stupid questions.
Yeah.
So let's go through some of these. So first off, when we hear the term structured and unstructured content, what does that mean? I imagine there's a gamut between the two poles, right?
Yeah, they're, to be honest with you, those are not very uh, tightly defined terms. So people can mean different things when they use those terms. So you're right. There's a spectrum there, and then people have different ideas what those things mean. Um, Let me try to explain this simply. So the structured part has to do with taking a a larger thing that you're talking about, and it generally is a topic or a task that you're creating information and messages about, and then breaking that into discrete pieces of information and messages, and then we call that structuring. And when you do that, the content becomes more modular, and that allows you to combine it in different ways or use different pieces of it at different times, or possibly substitute one version versus another version of a particular piece of that structured content. Um, when and you can structure content in different ways. With the way I advocate, it's structured for the whole life cycle of the content. So we have what's called structured authoring, where you're creating that content in a structured way. And then it's also structured delivery. So you can take that content um, in its structured state and deliver pieces of it as and when you need to. So it's a whole life cycle structured content. The unstructured is sort of the opposite of that, but what generally that refers to is that people create content all at once for a specific output. And generally, we think in terms of a document or a web page. So they're creating that whole web page all at once, and it's all that content is locked up in the container of a web page. You're not able to use it in other ways. Um, Now, when we said about the spectrum, it has to do with, was it created in a structured way to begin with? Sometimes people do structured authoring, but then they still kind of combine it into a web page, and at that point it's locked up. You can't do anything with it. Other times, people take a article that they create all at once in an unstructured way, and then they sprinkle on some structure, say on the front end. They'll put some there'll be some divisions in the front end that allow you to maybe show and hide some things, but it's not really true structure. So to get the true structure, you need to have the full life cycle of structured authoring to structured delivery.
Now, I wonder if that parlays well into our next one. Is content modeling, is it that practice of structuring content, or is it something different?
It is, yeah. So content modeling is one of these terms. To be honest with you, a lot of people who are not technical don't like this term, and they find it a little intimidating. It's like, I don't know what this term means. And but really, it is a way of structuring all your content, indicating the details that you want to have in the topics and the task that you're talking about. And then also to map the relationships between these things, because none of this is standing in isolation. I mean, there's connections between these things, and the content model provides the way of mapping the connections between the different topics and tasks that you are developing content for. Now, it has a particularly important role because this is the heart of a modern content management system, a modular system like we have a modular content platform at content.ai. We use a headless approach, and headless content management depends on a content model. So it is essentially the engine that makes everything happen. So it helps to shape the development of the content. So you have a structure there that authors can see and know what particular messages and information they need to provide and develop, and that goes into the content management system. The model is then managing that content in the CMS, and then it uses the model to deliver the content, and then that can be delivered to a front end, the model being the basis for that.
And I'm going to jump over one, because I heard you bring up modular components, I believe, in the first, structured, unstructured.
Mm.
Is that essentially what modular user experience is kind of developing approaches that utilize this to its best effect?
Not exactly, no. So modular user experience is a term I've invented myself, just because there hasn't been a good term out there. I'm not trying to coin a term for the sake of doing it, but what I see is that if you work with a headless content management system, and I'll assume that a lot of your listeners have some familiarity with headless content management already. You are decoupling the content which lives in the back end from the UI design, which is on a front end, and there could be multiple UI designs that you're connecting to your back end. And what I am trying to distinguish is the modular content, which lives in the back end and is managed by a content model in a headless CMS, needs to connect with your front end. And increasingly in more modern enterprises, they have developed a modular approach to their UI. They're developing design systems, for example, and these are UI components, starting with the lowest level components like buttons and things like that, but then they're rolling them up into larger components. And this is something that they're reusing, and able to be much more agile with how they develop front end experiences, and they're able to obviously make adjustments to the appearance of these things and the behavior. So that's what I'm saying, is that you have the modular design with these design systems, and you have the modular content. And if you bring these things together, if you find a way to map the relationships between these two sides, then you get the modular user experience, where you were able to be changing content independently of the design, but making them work harmoniously.
Now, in those design systems, if I'm not mistaken, is Storybook one of those kinds of solutions that organizations might use?
I think Storybook is just it's a way of assembling their design system. So that, I mean, there are a lot of different tools out there for managing design systems, and that's a big topic. I couldn't really do it justice in a short answer, but I mean, there's a range of things people are working with design systems, and there are different ways people capture those design systems and use them to implement into tokens and code and things like that. So Storybook is one of the tools that people use.
So I'll just go right to the emerging channels, omnichannel, because that is a really big part of headless,
Hmm.
composable thinking, right?
Right.
How do I was interested in how do content operations teams how do they work with that? So if there is a new emerging channel, which often might be an omni-channel, how do they need to almost put together a whole strategy, have brainstorming? Do they kind of try to go to market and launch and iterate, as they say sometimes? Like, what's the best way to handle that? Because we're getting thrown new channels all the time, I feel like.
Oh, yeah, we are, Matt. We're getting thrown new channels all the time. And I think the honest answer to your question is people are still figuring this out. Historically, each channel has been managed separately. And so you had a team who, the email team was separate from the web team, or the team developing the mobile apps were separate from the web team, and and then the team working on chat bots was a different group, and this has created lots of problems. So kind of going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, um, with say design systems, people started noticing that, hey, the experience on every platform was different, and that was one of the reasons I think design systems have emerged, is that people in organizations said, hey, we need to bring more coherence uh, to our experience across different channels. We need to make the brand appear the same. We need to give people the same expectations about the kinds of behaviors that they may uh, expect, recognizing, of course, that each channel has its own unique characteristics, but trying to at least bring greater unity across these different channels. So that's on the consumer facing end. But on the back end, where all the content is getting developed, that has been siloed up until recently. And now we're faced with the challenge of, like, how do we coordinate that? Well, the good news is that with headless, as you said, we have an ability to use some of the same content across more than one channel. Now, we're not quite at the point where we can say that any content that you create can be used on any channel. It's not that simple, but we can certainly reuse a lot of the content we developed across multiple channels. That's good, but that's not how organizations are set up. And this goes back to why I talk about content strategy, because you need to rethink your processes when you're introducing a new way of working with things. And so we need to start coordinating these different channel teams and recognize what's going to be unique for different channels and what do we need to harmonize in terms of the content. Now, in some cases, you can have some of the same content across different channels, and that's great. So now we have consistency in the information and messages that we're putting out there, and customers expect that. It's very important for customers not to be hearing different things depending upon what channel they're in. I mean, that's a nightmare when your email is saying something different than your website. But there are different affordances with channels. So we can't necessarily convey the same amount of information on a smartwatch that we can do on a website, right? There's just not enough space there. So sometimes you have to think about triaging this. What can we put out everywhere? Where do we direct people if we're not able to give them all the information in a particular channel? So there could be like, you know, certain channels that you can provide everything, other channels that will be where you provide more deep information, or sometimes alternative information if it makes sense to do that. And that's where we're just starting this process of figuring out internally in operations to how to coordinate this all.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I had my own, I don't want to go too deep into the story, but I had my own recent DoorDash piece where the customer service and the chat is not connecting with the other hand
Yeah.
on what I'm experiencing in the app in real time when my family needs dinner, and it keeps going down. So that's a very real thing. So let's do a this is your life slide, if you will. So when you say in this tweet, we can allow the folks to read it and you can speak over it, but when you say most published content is understructured,
Yes.
what what do you mean? I know it's going to tie to a bunch of the things we said, but that's a pretty daunting feeling, I think, because there's probably operations that are like, no, we're doing pretty well.
Sure, and I don't mean to. I mean, I'm making a big generalization there, and I don't want to shortchange the the great people who have been working with structuring content for quite some time. And this is not a new idea. Structuring content has been under development now for 20 plus years, and a lot of the technical content out there is structured, and people have been working hard to make it work, and they've made a lot of progress there. So, yeah, there are some people who they haven't nailed. But when we talk about the global universe of content, and if you take a large enterprise, they may have literally millions of web pages, and only a fraction of those are going to be structured in some way, the underlying content in them. So that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of unstructured content out there, and you can take pretty much any large company and find that huge parts of it are unstructured, and there are opportunities to structure it. Now, what are these opportunities? Well, I think, for example, a lot of the content out there is marketing content, and that's an area where there's very limited structure in marketing content, but there's huge opportunities to structure it. There are all kinds of information and messages that need to be presented in different, very expected scenarios, and you can start to structure that and start to reuse that, or find ways to test different variations of these things, and do things like that.
And I do have a slide here. I'm going to jump ahead to it because it made me think of it. I'm going to guess that unstructured content is where this idea of content debt can come from. Is that correct?
It's certainly part of it, yeah. Content debt is basically any time what you've done in the past is holding you back for what you can do in the future with your content. And there's lots of things that can be getting in your way. So if you have unstructured content, that means that content can't be easily used for other purposes than it was originally created for. It's kind of locked into its original output. So that's one form of content debt. But there are other things like just that your content's out of date, for example. And structuring the content can also help you keep that content up to date, because you may find that only part of it's out of date and the other parts aren't out of date. And so if you can isolate the parts that change and need routine updating from the parts that are going to be much more persistent, that's going to help with the maintenance of your content. But content debt really is a bigger idea. It has to do with your resourcing. So a lot of organizations haven't really put a lot of resources into content. It's always been there. They've been producing content, digital online content, for as long as the web's been around, but it's been a background activity. I mean, it's never really had a very high profile. So it's been going on, and the content keeps piling up, and different pockets of the organization are all doing their own thing. And the longer it goes on, the bigger a burden it becomes for the organization. They don't have any coordination between these different things. It's all building up. And when they do decide that they need to improve how they're managing their content and improve the efficiency of their content operations, they find they're stuck because they have all this stuff that's in their way, and then they don't have the right resources in place. And part of it's the tools, but part of it is the people. They don't have enough people. They don't have people with the right specializations. They don't have the people with the well-defined roles and responsibilities. And then they really don't have the practices that they need to have in place either. And these are things keeping people back. They don't have, well-defined processes for how they develop the content and review it. They don't have standards for like what's acceptable to publish. What things do we need to have in place? Are we, making sure that we are covering things like accessibility or, things like that. And all these things are holding back the organization. So it really can be very hard to dig yourself out of content debt, but you just have to start identifying areas that hold you back and then start working on them. And as you do that, you start developing some goals for what you want to achieve. You start putting some resources into it, and then you start moving up in your maturity.
Yeah, it's interesting because we use financial terms, right? Content debt, and I think when you start to clean it up, you might find some content equity
Hmm.
within the arbitrage,
Right. Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
will. Yeah, so I want to go through a few more items here. I was interested in this when I was looking through this because I never thought of a real delineation between content and creative. Um, and you've written about this. How is content different than creative? Is it? Like, what do you think on that one?
Well, I guess it really depends what people have in mind when you say creative. I mean, in the past I've worked at a big agency where you had the creatives, right? And they're there sort of um, sitting in front of a Photoshop program and developing something very glossy looking, and that was the creative. And that's obviously different than dealing with large volumes of content. But what I do want to disabuse people of the idea that there's an opposition between managing your content in a very deliberate and thoughtful way and being creative. So I think actually when you start to think about your content in a modular way, it can unlock a lot of creativity, because the essence of creativity, people say again and again, is the ability to recombine things in novel ways. So modular content allows you to think about the parts of the content and then how can they be combined in different ways. You can reorder them, you can make substitutions, you can connect them in different ways, you can leave parts out in different ways and come up with quite an endless variety of combinations there. And really what the creativity is supported through the modular content, because if you think about any of the great creative artists that we can think about, um, they tend to really repeat a theme of some sort. They have a theme in their work, whether you're talking about uh, you know uh, a visual artist or a musician or whoever it is, and they work and they develop that theme, and that's kind of their foundation, and then they make their creative uh, pivots off of that, and that's exactly what we have with modular content. You take these core elements that you're going to reuse, and you keep polishing them over and over and over again as you use them. You optimize them, you figure out how to make them as good as they can be, and then you add to that with additional pieces to give you this endless variety.
Yeah, it's almost like you use the word theme, but also team, right? Like I think back to that
Hmm.
Beatles documentary from a year ago now, which is shocking. It's been a year, but oftentimes, and I heard this when you were talking about the novel innovations that can come by modular experiences, because you can put what might seem like disparate things together and create
Hmm.
something greater than the sum of the parts. You often hear that with creators themselves. They
Oh
need
yeah,
another they need another person in the mix to make something better than the whole.
absolutely. Yep.
All right. So we did talk about this, but as content.ai is a headless CMS, I wanted to have a chance for this video to roll. But
That's
um,
great.
ha- you've hit on a bunch of these, but maybe if we can just tie it together. How does a headless CMS affect content strategy and operations? Because, when I go back, I had a Word document, I wrote my entire thing, then maybe I figured out where to bold, what's a header.
Right.
But now you're essentially, do they create content the same way and then figure it out how it's modular? Or how does a headless CMS, do you find, affect the content side of things?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways to look at it. One is your starting point is going to be a little different. So with a headless CMS, you have an opportunity for the structured authoring where there is a framework already in place. You could think of it as almost being like a template. It's not telling you exactly what to write, but basically these are the kinds of points you need to make. So it's not just like a complete blank canvas. You have some starter ideas there for what you need to be creating. But the starting point is different, but it's not the ending point. You can develop the content, and if you find that the structure isn't sufficient for what you need to convey, you say, I want to make an additional point. It's not part of the structure. You have an opportunity to improve the structure. I mean, you can change that structure at some point in the future, add to it. It's not uncommon that people will add some additional bits of message or information to a particular topic or a task that they're writing about. So it is a little more iterative, and the neat thing about it is not as episodic as writing an article. I mean, you write an article, you maybe spend some time doing it by yourself. You finish the article, it's published. That's the last you think of it. With headless, you think about the content rather than the article, and that content is a living thing. You create it, and it can be reused for years to come. And that's what's sort of exciting about it. This content has a life, and it's a living thing. So that's very different than the old way. So we say it's content first, and it's sort of a term that's used there, but you're really thinking about what is it you want to convey independently of how it's going to be expressed in a user interface. And how it gets expressed in a user interface later on may be radically different than how you were originally imagining it would be. But because the content is alive, it has that opportunity to keep morphing and changing its expression.
It's fascinating. So I know we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to ask one more question from my deck, and then we'll allow the questions to surface. I'm sure you read anything and everything about how newspaper publishers like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, handle content operations.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who, and I'm assuming you do, because I even like looking at that stuff, but my question is, how do they manage content strategy and operations? And what is similar and different to how mature enterprises handle those things?
Yeah, so I think that newspapers are in a somewhat different situation than enterprises are. They generally are publishing content that is not going to be revised after it's published unless they have like a correction to make. So it's a one-shot thing. They write it, they publish it, and it stays in the archive, but they're not touching it again. The other thing that's different about a newspaper, of course, is that they are, in most cases, charging for that content. So the content itself is a revenue product, as opposed to in an enterprise, the content generally is there to support some other activity that has some revenue implications. Either it's an expense in terms of, for example, customer support, or it, in some way supports, sales and marketing. So the incentives are different in the case of newspapers versus enterprise. In an enterprise, a lot of the content has a longer value, life value to it. You think about, you put product, information about your products out there. You, as long as you're offering that product or supporting that product, you need to keep that content up to date. There's going to be other things you say, so you go back and revisit that content and make revisions to it. So it's not just all about writing new content all the time in an enterprise. Although you do write a lot of new content in an enterprise, but there's a lot more emphasis on maintenance of content in an enterprise. I will say that I think newspapers, from what I read, and I've never worked for a newspaper, so other people might correct me on this, but I think it's becoming much more of a team activity compared to the past. In the past, I think you did have just assignments to one or two journalists to write things up. And they would run with it, and after it got its editorial review, it would be published. I think now I see a lot more coordination in newspapers among different teams. The data visualization team working with the writers, working with the 3D animation people and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on now in newspapers that maybe wasn't true 15 years ago. The other thing I have noticed is that I'm starting to see examples of newspapers reusing some content. So I gave a talk earlier this year at a conference, and I called out, say, the New York Times. They have these little sections where they pull out some key facts about a topic that's in the news. In the middle of an article, if you see an article about some topic that's being written about a lot, they pull out some of the key facts about the topic, and you can kind of go through them if you want to catch up, like, gee, I haven't really been following this topic. What's been going on here? So that's an example of how they're starting to adopt some things that maybe other areas have been doing for a while. And I think we're also starting to see interest in headless from news organizations. So I think the Washington Post, for example, has its own publishing platform, which I understand is a headless CMS, and I'm sure they're not the only ones.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that fascinates me is it might be one of our best examples of a really mature omnichannel usage case, right? I mean, it goes in print, in an actual newspaper, it goes into the web, it goes into mobile, notification system, apps, visualizations, like you said, that can be made available to other platforms, audio, they have spoken words. So I often try to use that as an example when I'm talking it through. Why don't we go to some of our questions? As we had discussed coming into this, I do have more slides, but this has hit a lot of them, and I want to give the audience a chance here to talk. So I know our first question comes from the renowned Sana Ramaki.
Oh, hi.
So Sue says here, can you comment on the role of DXC, which is digital experience composition, and experience orchestration platforms in coordinating how content modeled in headless CMS is consumed by each channel, touch point, or experience?
Yeah, well, this is a very exciting area, and I'm interested to see what develops with this because we're still in early days of all this, right? But what I would like to do is maybe distinguish between digital experience and, say, user experience. And I know some people kind of think of them as being a bit synonymous, but the distinction I would draw is that the digital experience, when I see it being used in the industry, to some extent is getting focused on some of the plumbing that you need to have in place to support a good user experience. So if we take something as basic as personalization, which lots of people are interested in. We need to have things like some knowledge about the customer, and you have some sort of customer data platform or something that you're able to draw upon to understand what segment someone is involved with, or things like that. Now, that is not directly part of the user experience to the person actually consuming the experience in a UI. They are not really, they're kind of indifferent to what's happening on the back end in terms of what's getting delivered to them. They just want to have their experience matched up with what it is that they want. So the content then becomes very important. The benefit, I think, of a headless CMS, with the content being modeled, is that you get this granularity that you need to have in place to support a good user experience, because people are not only going to have differences in terms of what they want, but at different points in time, they're going to need different things. So if we match this up with things like customer journeys, they will need different pieces of information at different points in time. They may need to see some of this information again to remind themselves of what they've done already, or what they should know about. And this is particularly true as customers are moving between channels, and this has been a trend that's been in place for at least the past 10 years, where customers are jumping between channels, and we need to understand what they've seen already and hand them off into the right information at the next channel that they're in. So I think the opportunity for the DXC really is around the coordination of all this. And it's a challenge, but I do think that there is lots of opportunities here. And what we want to do is think about ways that we can combine the information that we need to know about the customer and who they are and what they've done with all the rich content that's available, and be able to provide the right content to them at the right time.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more, if Akshay can load it in here. I believe it was about Figma. So it's very much in the news here. Yeah, so Figma was recently acquired by Adobe. I know you have written about Figma, and just interested in maybe a little bit of your thoughts on the acquisition, and also why it is important to the headless CMS and how it interacts with content presentation.
Yeah, so Figma is a tool that's pretty widely used in design teams. It's important to recognize it's primarily a visual design tool. People can use it to represent user interfaces. And as organizations have been moving more towards modularizing their front-end design, through design systems, they've been using Figma to represent components in their design system, pulling them out, showing how they would appear on a screen. And in some teams, especially teams that work on digital products, they have even been using Figma to populate a design with realistic content. Now, this is all really interesting, but Figma is still primarily a visual design tool. It's kind of similar in some ways to Adobe Photoshop. I mean, it works on the concept of layers and things like that. It's not really designed to handle text and other kinds of content. So we have a little bit of a gap where we're seeing people use this a lot, but it's starting to get very siloed what people are doing in Figma with how they may need to be managing content that would ultimately appear in a user interface, on the back end. So I've been having lots of discussions with people trying to understand, what are the opportunities to come up with some connections between Figma and, say, a headless CMS like content.ai. It's not as easy a problem to solve as you might think. I mean, there's definitely opportunities to connect to APIs there, but they have different models of working. So, as I said, Figma has this idea of layers, and you have, specific widgets that might be identified in a frame there, and that doesn't really correspond to, say, a content type very well. And so you may have this many to many relationship, and you need a way to figure out how to manage that. So interesting area. I do know of a few people who are looking at this. I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we do come up with a good connector out there that makes this easier to do. But as yet, I don't think it's a solved issue.
Perfect. Well, I think that is our questions, if Akshay had me right. Well, our questions plus the time. We got a lot of questions answered. Michael, really appreciate you coming on the DX Cafe towards the end of 2022 here, and I think it was a great discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's been delightful to talk to you, and I wish everyone a happy holiday ahead.